7. It's not based on anything other than those types of cars.
Sorry about that.
I started building it with the hood. I don't know what possessed me to grab a piece of brass and just started to hammer it out and fit it to an existing 7 that I had built. And so I guess I kind of started at the top and worked my way down with it. I had no plan to start to build anything when I started it, but after I played around with the brass hood, I got, well, another idea to make a cowl. And one thing led to another, and I built this whole car from scratch. The reason, I think what happened was I decided I didn't have a kid and I felt like building a Super 7. I have no idea why I have an addiction or whatever it is. If there's a 12-step program, I think I'm on number 8. I don't know. I honestly, I really don't have any excuse for that. I have to refresh myself since I've been working on other projects. I want to make sure I talk about this, not the other things that I've been doing that look just like it. So all the decals, everything was made from absolute scratch. No kit parts, no aftermarket parts. The goal that I set for myself was to see if I could fabricate every single piece, and if it wasn't up to snuff and I couldn't get it that far, well, the limitation was I would have to just live with whatever I made. I'm actually happy with it. Subsequently, I've actually become a better builder because of this, and since then. So it's been a great learning and working experience as a big picture for me. So again, starting with the brass hood, I used some aluminum rod and hammered it out with a brass hammer. And it was a pretty simple piece to make, following instructions on how to build a real hood from a book I have on real Super 7s. I reinforced it with some strips because it was quite flimsy, being only 10 thousandths thick. And I cut the hole in the hood for the carburetors. Without even having anything to measure to, I just eyeballed it. And realized that was probably not the wisest thing to do, because now I had to build the engine when I got to that to fit a hole in something that doesn't even mount to anything yet. So I learned a lot about logic and construction, flying by the seat of my pants, as it were. I was shortly into it, and I started just making parts from all over the car. Anything that interested me to either machine one day or to, a wild hair would come up. Hey, maybe you should have rear fenders that are different. Maybe I should have a trunk. Maybe this, maybe that. Without adult supervision, this is what you can get. And trust me, my dog tried to help me a lot, and I don't think his advice was really that good. So with the rear fenders, I just started with 40,000 sheet styrene, some 20,000s, and just started mocking it up, sanding, hacking, a lot of super glue, and I built them glued together, as you can see in the photo here on the right there. That allowed me to visually keep the symmetry, and the more I built it, the more I realized I didn't like it. So you can see a vertical cut where I changed the shape of the wheel well, and it went through several changes. Again, it was just, I didn't know what I was making, so I don't know if I was right or wrong at the time. I just was going with something that would look good. And once I got it to where they were equal and symmetrical, I took them apart and put a center section into it. And I found, I think it's Bounce brand dryer sheets and super glue make a really good synthetic fiberglass. And it is strong. And when you hit a little zip kicker on it, boy, it heats up really quick. It makes a lot of smoke, and but it's really hard. It's really strong. So I used a lot of that in the construction, and actually fiberglassed wire into some of the structures to give it even more rigidity. Once I had the basic shape done, I figured it looked too bland at that point. So I thought I'll put some scoops in the back, because I think I saw a GTO Ferrari picture one day. It's truly no planning, just seat of the pants stuff. Next page, please. After I'd had the back done, I scribed out the deck lid. To make that, I cut a template on my vinyl cutter that I'd drawn in Adobe Illustrator, placed it where I wanted it, and just continually traced it around it until I had the trunk lid. I also did the same thing with the vinyl cutter to make a pattern for the structure, the internal structure, and just laid them on styrene and cut around them as a tracing aid, and stacked up several sheets of styrene and built a lip on the inside. And the hinges were also done with, I used Adobe Illustrator to do the artwork, and I cut vinyl, and I applied the vinyl to sheet brass, about 10 thousandths thick. And then I immersed that in hydrochloric acid and hydrogen peroxide, and basically poor man's photo etching. Did it in the bathroom, found out you can use a coffee warmer to accelerate the process, and found out that it eats the chrome off the back of your mirrors in the bathroom. It's my bathroom, I can do what I want.
Don't need that mirror.
Well, hey, makes me look better. And I kind of, once I started making some of the brass parts, then my mind started thinking, well, what else can I make with brass? And they came in, things that didn't need to be made in brass, just like anybody that got into photo etch back in the 80s. We made things that we probably shouldn't have, but we could. For example, the taillight bezels, I made them out of brass and put them on the rear plate there, just because I could. And when it's all said and done, they're hardly even noticeable. But hey, it's all about having fun. The taillights were made out of amber acrylic rod for this is the turn indicator portion. The outer housing is just aluminum, machined out of 6061 rod, bar stock. And I actually used some Can-S. You know, honestly, I don't remember if I used Can-S tubing or if I actually machined that thin inner ring. And the center section is just clear acrylic rod that I painted red. Once I assembled it in to the rear panel, I realized that this is going to be visible because I made a trunk now. So I had to wire everything, pretty simple. And I got a wild hair and thought, hey, let's make a cam cover for it. I want to machine for a while. So keep in mind, I haven't even thought of what kind of engine it's going to be, but I guess it's going to be a 4-cylinder Hemi. Had some fun doing that. Then having the aluminum cam cover was a great help because I was able to build the styrene onto the back of it, and it was able to be removed quite easily. Then as we continued building the head up, I realized I'm going to have to put a header in it. So I made reinforced boxes there on the left side of the last picture. Oops. Did I do that?
No, it was me.
Oh, okay. I thought I had more control there. So these boxes there were to reinforce a part that I hadn't even figured out how I was going to make yet. You can see a recurring theme here. Then I got to making the block. And one thing I did have the forethought to do was to make sure that everything fit together much like a kit would fit together, so that it wasn't a bunch of butt-fitting things that would break apart. And it paid off very well because it was able to snap together the model for the most part as I mocked it up and built it. I made use of a lot of tubing, brass tubing and brass pins to make sure that things were solidly mounted. And as we progress, water pump was just made out of, I think it was plastruct tubing, some sheet styrene. I would just look at the photographs of the real parts and break them into individual sub-assemblies when they seem to be complex, like the water pump and the timing cover. Having built several of the Tamiya kits, I know how they were able to do it, but they're using injection molding. And I assume that they probably had done the patterns in somewhat the same way, if not more digitally done. Anyhow, I just made the pieces and built and built and built. Next page, please. And we're on to the oil pan here. And again, just sheet styrene, building it up, drilled holes, knowing how many bolts I would need. And I tried to keep in mind all the things that would have to be addressed later and try to factor in as many things as I could at the time I made the pieces. And sometimes machining hardware is very monotonous and boring. So I find I'll go out in the garage and just one day make fasteners. And I'll make half-inch fasteners one day, have a whole bag of them. Quarter-inch fasteners another day when the setup is all the same. So as we progress to the transmission, that's a PVC pipe Schedule C from my sprinklers that I had laying around because I had broken a sprinkler. It was just the right size. And the bell housing was done the same way by drawing it in Illustrator, printing it out on a piece of vinyl, putting it on some styrene and tracing around it and cutting it out and shading it to fit. The bell housing, on the other hand, was shaped on the lathe, and the starter housing, I think, was just more, plaster filled with CA. That's the color of the CA in the back, so it was no longer a hollow piece. The transmission itself, the last picture on that top panel on the right, that was just built up. Wow, how did I do that? That's just built up as a basic box assembly, and then the corners are rounded off on Up here, I just rounded them off with a file, and where I filed through, I put some more CA and built it up. And one piece after another, a pair of calipers and a straight edge, and just built that one section. I believe that's the center section of the transmission. The real thing is a modular transmission. It was called a Herald 5-speed. Back to using more brass, I figured this is kind of fun. And once you do the artwork and you throw it in the acid vat, you can do anything you want for 6 hours, because it's going to take a while to burn through, maybe even 12 hours. I did lose a few pieces. Learned not to let it do it overnight, because they don't all burn at the same speed. It actually got to the point where I was doing it in little frets, just like a professional part would come. And I had an attrition rate of about 20%. I think 80% was a pretty decent return. And so those are the two end plates, so that when the transmission was mated to the valve housing, I knew it would fit perfectly well. The middle picture here is the transmission top cover, the top loader, and it was done in 3 pieces of brass. So you've got the perimeter, you got the base, and then you have the raised, actually 4 pieces, 2 pieces in the center. And you can see a little bit of solder there to make the step smooth. And that was all soldered together using resistance soldering. And then we moved on to the tailstock. Again, it was just built up with pieces of sheet styrene stacked in to be what it's called a pyramid effect, and then filled in with a high fill primer, sanded, and moved along. I knew that this was going to be textured, so I had a certain latitude of, I don't want to say sloppy, but it just didn't have to be perfect, because it was all going to be masked with a heavy coat of paint with talcum powder in it to give it a texture. So once the tailstock was to the point where it looked good, I moved on to fleshing out. That would be fleshing out the tails. No, jeez, I really should have read up on this more. Trust me, I did build it. Okay, so that is the. Okay, that's the center case and the transmission. I'm on the wrong page, aren't I? What do we got here? Okay, yeah, that's the tailstock before texturing, just in primer over here. And then we've got the bell housing, the center section, and the tailstock with the top cover all splayed out in the middle there. Tailstock and transmission together with the bell housing. And at that point, I think I got bored with it and I moved on to the carburetors. I had some leftover bronze from Indiana Jones right at Disneyland. A friend of mine worked there and gave me all this scrap metal. And I thought that'd be kind of cool to make it out of bronze. No, not a good idea. This particular bronze has a lot of electrical junk in it, dirt. So whenever I milled it, it smelled bad. And when I tried to solder to it, it smelled worse. And it didn't want to take anything. So while it's kind of cool to say I made a pattern out of a piece of an Indiana Jones ride from Disneyland, no. I've got plenty of stuff if anybody wants it, because I'm never going to use it again. So you want to flip the page, one, please? Yeah, here we go. So that basically the main body milled out of a piece of 1/4 inch thick, probably 3 inches by 5 inches, and then I started cutting in the venturis using the mill and a center drill to create those holes. The bottom side of the carb is actually, the part that looks like a little oil pan is actually made out of styrene, because I was getting really frustrated with that bronze. The top is also done the same way, with the artwork drawn in Illustrator, printed on a 3D cutter, and then used as a guide to cut out styrene to get this somewhat intricate shape. And again, made another piece of it, which is the actual part, the top of the bowls. And continue to add more styrene details to it for tubes and flanges and what have you. And this is going to be a master. This will be cast so that both carbs will be identical. I also had technically not photo etched, but I brass etched the flanges for the carburetor where they mount to the intake manifold and to the air cleaners. The manifold itself, again, back to the brass being etched off of sticker material as my etch resist. I made both sides of the mounting points and then just used 1/4 inch brass tubing as the tubes. And I learned that it's not a good idea to try to etch all the holes because they either blow out or they don't go all the way through. So I found it was easier to just make small dimple or small holes on one side of the etch resist, which would essentially make center points to start drilling with a pin vise or something. You know, I continued and mocked it. I got this is the pattern mocked up to the manifold, and the manifold is a piece because there's only one. I don't need to make copies. And then we move on to casted copies of the carburetors of the Webers. I purposely made the top a separate piece because the real parts are that way, and I thought it would look more accurate once it was fully assembled if it was done in two pieces. And so the next, then we moved on to the wheels. Traditionally, I seem to do the wheels first. On this one, I don't know why I didn't jump in that way, but that's what I start with, a nice chunk of 6061 bar stock. And I bore it out and put the beads on it. I had the tires, the size of the tires I knew that I was going to use. I hadn't made the tires yet, but I figured, well, I didn't figure, I just did it. I had a Tamiya tire that I used as a guide for the size because I knew it was the same diameter that I was going to use. So I did use that for some mock-up. And as I continued, it's easier to make both what's going to be the center section and the outer section fit together before all the details are added. And that's what you see there, but it looks like a little pot and lid there on the bottom right. And so the next page, flip it over, and it's bored out from the rear. Make sure you have clearance for everything. And this is pretty mundane and simple work. You don't have any stress because you haven't done any detail work. If you screw up now, it's just aluminum and a few hours of time. So now I've got the outer wheel, and I know that the center section is going to fit fine, even though it hasn't been fleshed out, and I haven't even come up with what the spoke design will be yet. I made a mold of RTV from the aluminum master and cast white resin outer rims. And then I proceeded to work on making the center section. I knew it had to have 5 spokes because I'd already done 7 spokes on another one, and I didn't want to, make the same thing again. I don't want to keep making the same stuff. That's boring. I found this wheel in I forgot what company's wheel advertisement, and I just copied it. I think it's a Ray's brand wheel, 5-spoke, and just cut away whatever wasn't needed until I had what I wanted. This pretty much is done all eyeball by looking at the photographs of the wheel and scaling it to fit in 12 scale onto that car and adjusting the offset and the spoke, the lug pattern to fit the project. And since I didn't have the rotors made, it really didn't matter what the lug pattern was because I'll make them fit on the other side. When I got almost done with the wheel, I was really happy with the way it looked. But I realized, hey, I can photo etch, or I can etch a back cast piece that looks like a wheel. Not that you'll ever see it. But then I thought, hey, if I have a trunk, I can put a spare in and show it off. So that justified it, as if I needed any reason to do more stuff. The wheels, next page please. The wheels were also textured with talc powder mixed into the paint to give it a sand cast look. And the outer rims were just painted gloss aluminum. And I came to do the tire, I had all my bead measurements from the rim, and this is where you really want to make sure you take your measurements well because you can't test fit a hard part that's going to be a soft part later onto another hard part. I went to Home Depot with the tire, and they thought it was kind of weird, but I'm used to it. I'm going down the plumbing section trying to find a piece of plumbing PVC that has enough OD and enough ID, and I found these parts for 49 cents. I don't know what they're for, maybe a hot tub, but it had enough material. And I probably saved about 3 or 4 hours cutting time because the stuff cuts like butter. And it really takes a great finish. Drupelet tread pattern, again, I used Illustrator back then to create the Advan tire pattern that I found online. And for the lettering, I went back to the laser cutter, the stylus cutter, and I cut multiple layers of vinyl and applied them by hand to build up the 2 different heights and sizes of the sidewall lettering. And then it was time to make another RTV mold, and I cast them as each tire is made up of 2 halves. So I only had to make half a tire. And cast them in an elastomeric resin that was dyed black. And as you can see in the bottom corner, that's what they look like. And then I thought I should start making the frame, I guess. Well, at least that's what the pictures are telling me. I used square tube brass 1/8 inch. I did a bunch of measurements and figured that if this is a car built in America, it'd be a lot beefier than a Lotus. So it's probably about 20% heavier duty. And I had an 1/8 inch brass square stock, so looking at the pictures, I've got a really interesting book that shows how you're supposed to draw on your floor with some chalk and grease pencil, and then lay out your pieces and build your frame for your setup. So I used basic logic and did it in brass. Everything's pinned together where it can be, so it's really a rigid structure. I figured it needed to be very strong because I thought I was going to be manhandling it as I progressed through, and in some cases I actually did, so that forethought did pay off. Next page, please. Oh, we're still, I'm sorry, can you go back one page, I scroll down. As I built it, I continually, well, I learned a lot about heat management when you're soldering because, well, yeah, it's pretty simple. I only had a few pieces fall apart very early on, and I started making use of vice grips and hemostats as heat sinks, and that worked really well. And a lot of it was just forethought, just trying to plan ahead and don't get too mad when it falls apart because it's going to happen. And then also I figured out a lot of ways to build sub-assemblies that would slide together. That way I didn't have to risk a lot of work. If I broke one section, it was limited to that one piece, and I didn't have a whole house of cars fall down and have to start all over. And as it progressed, now it's time to fit the brass work into the body work. And I realized that as easily as the body fit on now, as I progress, I'm going to have issues with it lining up possibly. So I added some side supports and drilled the body so that it positively bolted onto the framework. When I was done with that, also I figured that I had to figure out where to put the seatbelt mounting, and I didn't want to mount them directly to the roll bar because I didn't want to build that style roll bar. So I have a rear plate that protrudes through the bodywork that would work adequately well in a real car. Before I got too far, I mounted up made some motor mounts, again, etched brass, and soldered them into the framework. And that posed to be some interesting logistics problems of trying to build the motor around the frame, in the frame. But I only had to cut a couple parts out and replace them. If there was only instructions, I would have done better. I painted the frame just satin black. I think I just used good old-fashioned Krylon and painted it in probably 20 different applications to get all the different angles. That was kind of fun to make sure I got full coverage on everything, all the while knowing that most of it won't even be seen. The rear axle, next page please. Rear axle is a DD-on tube style, traditional on a Super 7. It is what it is, just more milled pieces, soldered them together. I wanted working suspension. I figured if the Tamiya people could do it, I could probably do that. And plus it would make sure that all four wheels touched the ground. I had a lot of fun with the rear differential, again with the photo, or I keep calling it photo etching, it's just acid etching of vinyl cut parts. And you can see the pieces on the left there. Once they're all cleaned up, soldered together, and then I started building the rear end for it. Again, I was able to use the pattern of the rear cover as the rear starting point. There's another brass piece on the back side here, and building up a box with there's actually two tubes, horizontal, kind of a T-shape for the input shaft and the output sides, and they're all soldered together nice and strong. And then I built the box around it, added the ribbing, and just fleshed it out to match the photos. Scroll down, please. Okay. Once it's in primer, it starts to look a little bit more like what it should, with another texture coating with talcum powder. And the more you can put a lot more powder in to get a lot coarser look, less talcum powder, a lot softer look. It's very versatile and very easy to work with, and if you don't like it, you can either wipe it off just like paint or just knock it down with a wire brush, a brass wire brush. To get all the pieces to fit in the rear end, I use brass brass tubing. Since I'd already built the center section with brass tubing, I just cut brass rings in telescopic sizes to fit together. And then I machined the CV joints out of aluminum, cast them in the same material as the tires with the die and everything, so that they're soft rubber. And plugged them on, and that makes, when I get around to putting the axles into it, got plenty of room to flex, and the rear suspension, when it works, will flex. And I don't have to make it a true hinge point. Next page, please. And that's pretty much the finished item, and it's been knocked down with the wire brush to give it a little weathered effect, some smoke in the crevices to force the shading and to give it a slight grungy look. And then I moved on to the header. That was something that I'd thought about for quite a while as I was building other parts, because I really hadn't figured out how I was going to make it other than I was going to use solder. And I've had this roll of fat solder for years that's been earmarked for this. And if I were to do it again, I would make the mounting flange out of metal of some sort, probably aluminum. I had problems with the plastic breaking because of the amount of stress it took to fit it on. But at the time it was easy to work with, and well, live and learn. I made a little collector set out of more brass tubing cut to size and then molded together, and that served as a nice way to hold the collector set together as I bent it and formed it to fit to the flange. I found it took me many trips to different pharmacies to find this tape that looked right. And again, you go shopping and you try to tell people what you want, but you're not buying it for what it's intended for. You can have fun with it, or you can just really alienate people. But I stumbled on this stuff at CVS, and it was just perfect. And the guy had no idea why I was so happy that I found this tape. And it cuts really well. Just put it on some glass, cut it. It doesn't fray very much at all. Very easy to work with. Wrapped it up and gave it a light dusting of some smoke. And then just rubbing my hands on it after being out in the shop gave it the perfect patina, the grunge that asbestos tends to pick up. The collector was made out of more brass and some aluminum soldered together, not the aluminum solder, of course, so that it fit into the earlier made piece. And I wound some springs with some fine wire to tie it all together to make it look like a regular collector would. The flanges, again, were done with the etched brass and with the stickers. So everything lined. That was another feature that works really well using the etched brass. If it lines up in the artwork, it lines up with the finished part. And it makes up for a lot less headaches. The muffler is just turned out of a solid chunk of aluminum. The heat shield was made out of a piece of brass tubing, brass tubing. And I would go online or through my hot rod catalogs and find different manufacturers. And this DT brand apparently makes some nice tuner type mufflers. I like their logo, it was pretty simple. So I used the same acid etching technique on the aluminum. And you're not supposed to use that acid fire, just a little bit. And it does melt the resist, so you've got to do it in small incremental hits, otherwise it'll like bleed. Well, it'll kind of like bleed under like a bad paint job. And once it's all together, and you can see in the lower picture there, it actually looks pretty close to the etching that came on the real item, which gets completely covered up by the heat shield. But I got a picture. I made a steering rack with bellows and used the same technique of casting them in the elastomeric resin so that they're soft and pliable, and set about to make a working rack and pinion, just because the Tamiya kit came with it. Turned out to be a lot harder than I thought to cut those gears. Anybody ever try to cut gears that made it? Did you get it right the first time? Yeah, I gave up after the fifth. I got the gears to work, but I couldn't get them to hold up to the rigors of actually working. I could turn the wheels and make the steering wheel move, but every time I turned the rack, I'd break it. So it's a model. I left the rack out. And it works just fine.
That's made out of aluminum, the rack?
The rack was made out of aluminum, and it slides in brass. The gear is also aluminum. And I finally got it right. I finally got all the angles and everything right. It's just that I didn't build in the right tolerances, and honestly, it was kind of a gimmick that I thought would be fun if I could pull it off. But I learned that I don't like doing that. I was after more visual realism than actual functional realism, but it didn't stop me from trying to make actual working U-joints for the steering shaft here. Am I doing that or are you doing that?
You did that.
Okay. Here we go. Yeah, they worked until I put paint on them. But since you couldn't turn it anyways, it didn't matter. It's kind of a moot point. But if it looks real, to me, I'm happy. If it looks realistic, again, that's really the goal I was after. I'm not really a working parts kind of a modeler, but if I can get them to work, yeah, I'll go with it. Next page, please. So here I had to route it along the frame. I found some examples where this is done. It's not the best way to do it, but thankfully I'm not driving this car. I actually saw one of the McLaren M4, M2, I'm not sure which one, a few years ago, and I was astounded at the acute angles that they used on their steering. Figured if it's good enough for McLaren on the street, it's good enough for a model that will never hit the road. And you won't see half of it anyways. And I moved on to the brakes, rotors. Rotors and hubs, more 6061 aluminum. I used a 1/32 end mill to cross drill the rotors and make them directional. Just basic simple math, geometry to get the spacing. There's a front pair and a rear pair, left and rights obviously. And when it came to do the calipers, I had gotten quite comfortable working with the brass process and stacking things up. So I built, I believe that's 8 or 9 pieces to stack up the caliper here in the center. And again, this is going to be a master, not a single piece, so I only need to make one good one. I had to make sure that it was symmetrical though, so it would work on all 4 corners. Now, I built a 12-scale Camaro many, many years ago and had machined calipers for it back in probably 1993. I was never happy with them because they were undersized for one thing and they didn't look like a GM item for another. But they looked exactly like these mechanical parking brakes. So I stole them from a project that had stalled years ago and used them for the rear parking brakes. For the front, and here we got the front gear, the offspring of the brass master main calipers assembled together. Here we have all, now I went and machined all the individual hardware for them so that they look more realistic on the front side. The back side I just used, I'd actually already machined parts that were cast into it and I painted them since they won't be visible or be hardly visible at all. Saved me probably in the neighborhood of 30 pieces, 30 machine pieces I didn't have to make, but they're still represented within detail. The shocks were made out of brass and aluminum. This is the fronts here, and they use a threaded rod. It's a small cap screw I picked up at the hardware store. Found, I think they're it might be 080. I'm not sure. They were the smallest ones that they had. Then the wind springs, that was kind of fun. Front springs weren't that hard to wind because they really don't have a lot of compression and it was easy to wrap them around, get them uniform looking. The rears are a little bit different story. The rears have a lot more travel and it took me a while to get them to wind and look right. And I thought this is probably a whole day and I got a really good set, mocked them up on the car, swished the suspension, and springs never returned, so that's not the right material. But I figured out how to wind the springs. I just needed to find the right material. And I ended up going with spring steel that you get at Hobby People for aircraft stuff. And that stuff is a real bear to work with. But they didn't compress. As you can see here, they actually do work. The original wire I think was a bead wire. And yeah, it's really easy to work with, but there's too soft, no memory. So once that hurdle was done, machined the nuts with they're actually cross-lock nuts machined as one piece. So once the part's installed, I don't have to fiddle with 3 pieces. I can do it as a washer into 2 nuts. Okay, next page, please. I've got the shocks installed. As you can see, I've already finished the gas tank, but I'm going to start right now. So simple box made out of sheet styrene. The grooves were milled on the milling machine before it was assembled. I just milled the individual pieces, used some double stick tape on the table, and went at it, really simple. When I was shaving the bell housing with the PVC pipe, I realized it was throwing these really odd strands. And I was building this online, sharing my progress, and I'm not sure which form it was. It might have been Model Cars magazine form. Some smart, somebody might be here actually, said, well, why don't you scratch build the wires? You're scratch building everything else. You know, you're not using scratch built wires, you're using sourced wires. That's not really a scratch built model. And I thought, yeah, that's all I need. And so I took some of those little furry, squirrely things and a paint pen and used my scratch built wire for the field wiring sending. It's not that easy to work with, it's not that hard either. It's not as uniform as I'd like, but you know, I'm all for trying new things. And you know, kind of silence that for a day or two. The rear trunk, the inner trunk liner is just made up of sheet styrene, about 10 thousandths, I think. Pretty thin stuff. I realized I was starting to run into a stack tolerance issue at this point, and realized I really need to start making things as thin as possible. And then I realized the engineering thing, how do you get that thing that's supposed to be bigger than the top rail in? And I kind of cheated and hammered one of the bars on the rear here back just a little bit so it slides in only from that side and there's enough flex in it. The rounded part here, that's to make room for the spare tire. And it's the piece of a Tamiya spray can cap. And I milled a couple lips into it so it fit positively onto the styrene and just super glued it in. Didn't want to stay that well, but without a lot of flex, it's not a problem. And then I realized, now I can't get the trunk out. So thankfully, it didn't stick too well. So I broke the part off and remembered to glue it back on when I went to the final assembly. While I'm playing with the trunk, I started thinking, well, what's in the trunk besides a tire? A jack. So I made a jack, still enamored with my self-discovered little brass edge trick. And so I drew this up in Illustrator, kind of an origami thing, and I built this little scissor jack. And I used, I believe it's the G string, the largest string out of a regular guitar, electric guitar. I'm not a musician, I just play the stereo. And it had the threads in the right way and everything. And so it actually worked. I used a flat bastard file to knurl the handles on the jack. And this is a great diversion because I was getting a little burned out on some of the car stuff, but for some reason this seemed to be perfectly appropriate to have fun, and it's still for the greater cause, greater good, bigger cause. I realized, well, now I need to get I need a tire iron too. And the studs that I'm using were actually cap screws, kind of like an old Volkswagen. So I made a working lug wrench out of brass and aluminum. And next page, please. Thought I should use a famous name brand, but being the smart ass that I am, I thought, more power, bin for tools. Next step was the windshield frame. It was more brass, soldered together. Thought I'd do something a little different, just to make sure that anybody that saw this model wouldn't assume that it's just another Tamiya kit. So I found a custom. Didn't really like the idea, didn't think it was all that great, but it was unique enough. I thought I'd take a stab at it. So I made a rear view mirror that fits into the slot. Since it's not going to be not going to have a roof, it wouldn't be an issue. So that's the reasoning behind that. And just made the pieces, put them together. The clear itself came from some vacuum form plastic package. It might have been Hot Wheels, it might have been something for the kitchen, I don't remember. I just found this the right thickness, a nice clean piece of plastic, and stowed it away for this purpose and made use of it. On the bottom corner we have a side view mirror turned out of aluminum. It's got a fisheye lens to it, all polished out, all aluminum, and the mounting hardware that goes with it. And at this point, we've got the original hood is now still with a hole in it and no engine to go with it. But I need to make a nose cone, and I realized I really need to make the nose cone fit to the hood. So I basically built a jig out of styrene and cemented it to the brass with super glue, knowing it'll pry it right off. And then built jigs or mounting tabs with L-shaped brass so that it all fixtured up and lined up. And then I started building the styrene nose cone on that piece of styrene so that it would all fit. And then I cut out what I didn't need and did my fiberglass trick with the dryer sheets, and it became really tough. I dropped that thing a dozen times and never broke it. Not on purpose, just, hey, it happens. Then I decided I needed something unique for the grill, and I've always liked the back of the Trans Am that has that checker border of honeycomb, same with some of the Mach 1s, Mustangs and stuff. So I set out to try to recreate that, and I think it took 5, 6 times at least to get it burned through uniformly and not burned through too much. And it took a lot of fine tuning. Yeah, I was getting tired of making that grill, there's no doubt about it. I think that probably spanned over a month of now on, now again, on again, off again. And when it was finally done, I felt like I really accomplished something. To do the front splitter, the front air dam, I put a piece of tape onto my new made nose and glued a piece of sheet styrene that I'd fitted, kept filing it away until it fit, and then just cemented it to the tape and built up a lot of super glue on that tape, let it dry, peeled it off with the tape, and then I didn't have to damage or clean up anything under the nose. And once I peeled the tape off, I just finished up the fillet that was created by the super glue and created a perfectly fitting front splitter. Next page. Front fenders, I figured if to me a paint cap was good enough to work in the trunk because it was the right size, it'd be oversized, might work for a fender. So I milled out the center of another cap and cast it and made that blank in the center. The picture on the left was made up from, again, cutting parts out of vinyl as my guide to cut out a left and a right, and they were glued together the same fashion, just lightly tacked together as I did the rear fenders to get them symmetrical. And I did some mill work to clean it up, kind of roughed it out. I did a lot of hand finishing because the vibration of the mill tended to shake the two parts apart. Again, you can see them glued together, same thing to keep the symmetry. And then they're popped apart, primed, and ready for paint. Lower control arms were done with brass tubing, not rod. It is all, I'm trying to remember. They take that back. The two long parts on each one, the two main parts are rod, the rest is all brass tubing with a flat piece together to tie it together at the gusset. To make the mounting points for the upper control arms, the things that look like Band-Aids there, were done with acid cutting again. And I've learned the trick of only etching. I'd controlled it, a little bit more control. I was able to cut one side to give it a fold line, cut both sides to get it a decent hole, but it still had to be hand finished and honed out. And then they were assembled into these little apparatus here, all soldered together, which were then carefully soldered on to the frame so that they wouldn't fall apart when they're being soldered on. Got lucky on that. Then I had to make the sway bar and stabilizer link and figured I might as well make the bushings and everything. And at this point I'm putting a lot of stuff in little bags because the parts are getting smaller and smaller. And I'm also making lots of extras just in case. And so I have a lot of leftover parts that I have no idea what I'll do with. But I didn't have to look for them when I drop them. That's kind of nice. You just drop it and, oh well, I'll pick up another one and keep going. So as I'm progressing now, I've got the body, the frame's pretty much fleshed out. And it's time to start adding some body panels to it. I didn't put louvers in the hood because honestly I didn't know how to, and I've always thought that the louvers in the hood detracted from some of the flow of the car. So to compensate for that, I put these air extractors in the side. And the Tamiya kit has a really nice Chinese jigsaw puzzle effect where you assemble the header as you put it into the car onto the engine. But that ship had already sailed too far. So I made a separate little access panel, as I've seen in other cars. And that way I could put the header on, drop the panel on, put the lower piece on, and what did they say, Bob's your uncle. Roll bar is all solid brass, hand bent. I used quite a bit of annealing. I stopped using the oven because it just seemed to be inefficient. So I was annealing with a torch, and it seemed to speed things up quite well too. makes the bending much easier to get a uniform shape. And the flanges on this one are also done with the acid cutting techniques discussed before. And where the uprights are, they are pinned into the brass, so holes were drilled into both pieces, more brass is inserted in. And as I recall, I actually mocked this up on the frame over here before I soldered it, and while I soldered it to keep the lines, to keep all the angles correct. Next page, please. I had made a resin master for the Blue Super 7 that I brought here in 2007, and I still had the mold for it. I changed some of it, and well, the mold was a little wonky, so the parts that came out of it were different, but still manageable to be saved. And the center section that held the seatbelt guides were done in brass before, or sorry, it was out of aluminum before. I took one of them and cast them in resin, got a better finish, and moved on along. Made seatbelt hardware, again with the acid technique. That's the set right there before it's assembled, and here's the upright buckles. A couple of them already folded into shape. I used some, I think it was Chart Pack brand masking tape that I found that has a very fine texture. It doesn't look like a woven texture, but it seems to, it looks good enough for me for the seatbelt material. Lots of folding, and it's kind of a tedious job. I actually mocked it up on the car to make sure all the lengths were correct. Excuse me. And I wanted to make sure the seats were different than the last one, because I just, with as many of these things I build, they all have to be as different as possible. It sounds like an oxymoron, but it's the way my mind works. I went back to the vinyl cutter and I cut these vinyl tufted panels, 262 pieces per seat. And I thought I could use transfer tape, lift it off, and put it on the seat. No, the contours would not allow that, so I tediously put them on one by one, and there's 2 layers, and each one is a different size, so that it, much pyramid effect, where the ones on top are slightly smaller to give it more of a domed piece once I paint over it. Sometimes I do things and I wonder why I did it afterwards, but it's done, so I would never think of doing, the amount of time I spent doing that, I can't imagine spending 6 hours doing that. But the time was passed and I was done, and I have to figure out a better way to do it next time. That's assembled on decal paper. So now those 3-dimensional vinyl pieces will be water slide applied to the seats. That way if I screwed it up, I'm only screwing up a decal. Did the pedal set, built the foot boxes. The pedals are, the clutch and brake pedals are actually styrene with brass tubing. Losing my ability to think of words at this moment. The throttle is all brass, and I'm guessing that that's probably the pin they ride on. Yeah, that's got to be it. I'll go with that. Then we've got brake master cylinder. The master cylinder reservoir was milled out of white resin, just raw leftover resin. Whenever I cast, I throw whatever's left over into a little Dixie cup or something, throw it into the pressure pot, and make leftover stock with no porosity. And it looked pretty close to the translucent plastic that's prevalent on a lot of cars. It just didn't look quite right, so I did go ahead and give it a light coat of flat white to make it look better to my eye. The electrical connection is actually freehand milled out of the same resin. That stuff cuts really well, and you can do more delicate things with it than you can with aluminum, because you can use some of the tiniest end mills and not have to worry about breaking them. That's the cap itself, and aluminum body was made for the body. And the rear flange, it's a kind of a diamond-shaped item that was milled separately and then popped onto the boss that I left. And then the brass fittings were pressed in for where the lines would come out. And again, I've got brass posts to plug the reservoir on when it comes time to assemble. Built the clutch master cylinder much the same way. And then I assembled them into the footwell, which will actually be under the hood when it's all done. I did a bit of weathering on it as well, because even the cleaner cars I see, for some reason, this stuff seems to sweat and collect dust, and quite often it's a relatively dirty part on a relatively clean car. And here we have the clevises added to it, and return springs, and all the stuff that would make it work as a nice little individual piece that will be plugged in from the top when it comes time to assemble it. Chassis floor pans were done with sheet styrene. I know I should have gone with metal because of the rest of it, but the styrene was just the right thickness, and it was able to be made in a matter of minutes. The rivets were actually punched out with a piece of brass tubing, bare metal foil, and applied individually. And then I printed decals to make up for the ring and the hole for a pop rivet, and applied them individually. And then clear coated the whole thing with dull coat to seal it and keep them falling apart or shifting. The transmission tunnel is also styrene. Some of the things had to be done in styrene after I'd done so much in brass, because I needed things to flex to get them to fit in. And so, it's not a convoluted piece with the foot box, but I guaranteed that it would all line up. And we had the shift boot. That was actually a really fun piece to make. I took a piece of aluminum and milled a concentric set of circles to make the pyramid-shaped boot. And then I just poured the elastomeric resin into that, using it as a mold, and popped the one piece out. And milled a bezel, aluminum bezel that popped into the transmission tunnel. Next page, please. Drive shaft is made out of brass rod and brass tubing, and milled aluminum for the yoke assemblies. And I even made the little cross thing. I tried to make it work. I didn't get it in phase. It's not exactly right. So I bet this thing would vibrate really badly, but it's enough to make it look good and fit it in. I did put balancing weights on it, but not having a balancer, I made it worse.
With all that torque, it just twisted it.
What's that?
Say the torque of the engine, it just twisted it.
I'm thinking as cool as this thing in theory would be, it'd leave a big puddle on the driveway so to try to drive it. Well, I did put oil on it, so the dash is made out of styrene, and I put brass receivers on the back of the dash to accept what will be the aluminum gauges. Just makes them fit better and more positive fit, makes it easier to build. I made a grab handle, looks like a plumbing item over here. That's just soft aluminum rod that I bent around an X-Acto knife and then around a file, and increasingly smaller diameter handles of things on the workbench. Used a pin vise to drill some holes to put mounting pins in it, some brass tubing cut to, this is all just hacked up on the workbench, no machining, just something to fill out the rest of the dash. To make the lenses for the gauges, I don't know if it's really visible on bag, but I made a punch out of brass and punched out styrene, 5,000 styrene lenses. And I did the lenses first this time, because last time I tried to make the lenses fit the housing, and it's a lot easier to machine a housing to fit an existing lens. I know it's not proper to have a stereo on a Super 7, but a lot of things I do to these things aren't proper. And I found this really cool waterproof stereo online. So I made a copy of it out of etched brass, because, well, that was kind of, I guess that's my etched brass phase. Found some pile speakers. I liked the grill design on them, replicated them as well. And for the speakers, I found a calculator that had died behind the buttons, had these great little speaker-like things. And so I just took a little disc of the heavy-duty duct tape that you would put ducting in your attic, the foil ducting tape, and punched out discs and plopped that in to give it whatever the centerpiece is. The dashboard I ended up texturing just by painting several coats of dry black paint on it until it picked up a pebble finish. The gauges I chose to replicate are called Phantom, they're by Auto Meter, They don't use any electrical for the illumination. They're phosphorus, so you shine a flashlight on them and they glow for several hours. And I thought, I don't have to wire that, I'm doing that. So I made special decals for it, and I actually made needles for them, and they sit on pins, so they're raised up off the face of the gauges, and then the bezels were milled to be steps, so pieces just plop in one by one, glue them together, drop them in the dash, and there we have it. And then we have my cheesy little Chinese MP3 player, and I had a Kleenex box that had this holographic effect to it. Yeah, and I have a green one and a blue one, and the green one looks about the color of the glow in the picture, so I cut a little piece and stuck it in there, and that's what it is. Next page, please. The radiator, I want to make sure that you could see through it, so I built up a box of styrene. It was the easiest way to go, and drilled into the sides to accept the cooling tubes. Also made a fan at the same time. The fan is supposed to be offset to clear the sway bar. It looks like a mistake, but it's actually correct. The oil cooler down here is actually, what's the name of the train company? The model train company. The guy has a little hat. Yes. They have corrugated roof, N-gauge corrugated roof panels. And I just cut a ton of strips like ribbons and stacked them all together. And it just happened to work out. It was flow through, see-through, and put it into another housing made up of styrene. For the filaments on not the filaments, the radiator core itself was made up of a combination of steel rods for the horizontal and fishing line filament for the verticals. And then I used some photo etch screen for both sides, the bug catch screen, and left the back open. You can see behind the radiator. And in the photo you can see that it's probably more see-through than a real radiator should be, but once it's in the car and you've got the lack of light, it does the illusion that it's a see-through radiator. I always enjoy doing steering wheels, scratch building them, and every one I want to make different, just to explore different techniques. This one I milled a D-shaped groove in a piece of aluminum. I think it was a 3/4 inch piece of stock to start with. Then I annealed some brass rod and wrapped it around and hammered it and soldered it together at the bottom to get the overall shape. The spokes were done with the brass etching technique, and it's actually 3 pieces where you have the 2 leather pieces here that were soldered on top, and then the same, the center section here. The hub is machined aluminum, and that's the steering column aluminum, and the turn indicator out of aluminum. Am I saying brass sleeve aluminum turn indicator? Once it's all assembled and painted, I made a carbon fiber decal because I couldn't find one that was just the right weave for this tiny little piece. I found some that looked really cool, but they're a little too coarse, and the ones that were too fine were absolutely too fine, and they just looked black by comparison. The yellow band is a piece of vinyl, very thin vinyl I wrapped around it, and then I put several coats of satin clear to give it the look of leather and to fill in, and then sanded that smooth like you would if you were to clear coat over decal stripes and blend them in on a body.
Make your computer easier to use. Windows will read and scan this.
I made decals to do the stitching around the inside of the wheel itself. And the horn button is a Momo. Almost all the wheels I make are Momos because that's what I run on my rail cars whenever I replace a wheel. Moving on to the license plate. I'd experimented very early on when I was playing around with the brass etching technique, and I made a license plate. And I thought, I got it down to where I can do the face, but it would be kind of cool if I could make it look like it was really stamped. So, knowing it'll never be seen, I went ahead and spent another 12 hours making it. So I etched this from both sides using 2 different sets of artwork so that the lettering that says Unique 7 is different sizes. So they don't burn through and create a hole. Yeah, I did it, so I'm done. And continuing on, I painted it with TS45 pearl white, and you have pearl white over gloss white. Then I applied a decal that I had made for the lettering, and it even has the little tag callouts. In California, they actually write where you're supposed to put your tags because, you know, I guess they figure most people wouldn't know. I milled out a aluminum license plate frame. It is 2,000 7-inch thick. It's very delicate. But once it's snapped onto the brass license plate, it has plenty of integrity. I found some cheesy license plate frames. I'm not a big fan of the way it looks, but everything else looked like something else I'd already done, so I opted for something different over something that was more aesthetically pleasing to me. The tags are made up of decals that I made. The actual, sorry about that. The actual tag, I save my renewal tags every year because it's a little 1/4 inch strip that you don't use. And I cut them up and I use them as the actual tag on the license plates. And then I print the correct year that corresponds with the colors. And I have a list, and I keep a record of all the colors and all the years. And so I also use the year of the year that I finished the model in. So when I'm old and senile, well, I'll know what year I finished it. Or maybe when I'm just senile. Then we've got the headlights. I went with a projector style beam rather than the regular type that you would normally see on a Super 7, since the projectors are kind of popular, at least they were for a while. The aluminum housing, these are masters here on the left, machined out of aluminum. And I cast them in resin. And for the lens itself, the outer lens, I did another aluminum master as a buck and used my own Intel vacuum form and made actual lenses that go on it. And the projector bulb itself was machined out of clear acrylic, and then a little bit of diluted transparent blue was painted on it to give it that, what they call HID, the blue light, high intensity. Yeah, thank you. And the amber turn indicators were used they use the same amber material I used on the taillights. And this was also designed to be sport cars, so the pedestals that they're on are designed to be dropped in, bolted in, and on the real car you could actually take a bolt, pull a light, and disconnect a clip, a plug, and so that's represented in the finished car as well. Let's see, I put a fire extinguisher in every one of my models because I lost one of my first car got lost to fire, and so I'm protecting my models, yes. I have memorial cars too. I've done several fire extinguishers. I used whatever is hanging on the wall in my shop or in the back seat of one of my cars to model them after. It's an aluminum turned bottle. Since I had no place to put it on, last time I put it on the roll bar, I didn't want to replicate that, so I decided to put it on the interior. Needed to make a mounting fixture, so I did that out of brass. It's made up of tubing that's been milled and some flat stock that was bent and soldered together. This spray head is something I just take the same leftover raw resin stock, and I'll have the spray the actual fire extinguisher in front of me, and a pair of calipers and a calculator, and cross between freehand cutting and eyeballing it and measuring it. And there's the head that comes out of it in the center. Once it's all painted, I put an aluminum spout on it, and I make a gauge. This one actually has a needle and a lens on it because I'd gotten better with my lens making when I did the dashboard. And this is actually a hold down strap. Excuse me. A hold down strap to quick release hold down strap so that it doesn't bounce out of the car, and get a good indication of the size of it. And you have to have a safety pin. So that's made out of, I want to say 5 thousandths of red wire that is bent and then plugged in. And I didn't even lose it. I was really surprised how many times I dropped it, found it, didn't lose it. Because it was probably easy to make. That's the Murphy's Law thing. The distributors next. Took a piece of brass stock, milled it up, turned it on the lathe to make it round, make the cap shape, milled 5 holes in it, and used more brass rod to make up the boot points, and then made rubber boots out of vinyl tubing, I believe. No, I actually machined those. No, how did I make those? It's embarrassing. Yeah, those are machined out of, that's something. What did I find? Oh, no, they're resin copies, that's what it is. I machined, good thing I wrote notes. I machined a master out of aluminum and cast resin copies. And I used the same black dye that I was using on my tires to dye the white resin to make the boots, so I didn't have to paint them. Made up a little badge on the side of it. It's just a regular decal here, and the back in advance as well. Next page, please. Coil was made along the lines, same thing. Coil. Wait a minute. I'm sorry, I skipped the wrong page. You're on the right page, I'm on the wrong page. Went to the alternator. The kit alternator that I built on the last one, I didn't care for it at all, so I fabricated one that I thought was a lot more accurate. It had filaments and windings and all sorts of things you can't see. And since I already did it once, this was relatively easy to do. I just copied the way I did it last time. And this one came out a little bit better with fewer parts. You know, you learn as you go along where you can cut corners and people won't see them. And the finished item is up here. And here's the back of it with the mounting plate. The cogs were all machined out of aluminum. Fortunately, simple math tells you that when something turns half the speed or twice the speed, it's just twice or half the amount of teeth or diameter. So it was really easy to cut those correctly for the belt that will run them. Making the belt, I learned from the last one, I used zip tie, nylon zip tie. And I cut a channel in a piece of aluminum that's the exact same width as the zip tie. And I super glue it in and I throw it in the freezer. And after about an hour, I take it out and put a nice cube on it to keep it cold. This material cuts better when it's ice cold. And just monotonously cut 50,000 screws in it. And then you have the fun part of shaving it down to be the right width. Every once in a while when you're cutting the stuff, the vibration will pull it up and you've got to stop immediately, cement it back down, throw it back in the freezer, and start over, continue your work. So far, I've got it down to where I can do it without destroying it. I just have to do it in phases. To get the right width, after I've got the teeth in it, I just mill back and forth until it's the right width. And it pops right out. You throw it into some acetone, and it comes out clean as can be. And it doesn't even need to be painted. There's the water pump and the adjusting bracket for it, and the timing cover. They're in the upper left now. The starter was made up of brass and aluminum with a solenoid and more wiring. Just at this point when I'm doing the wiring, I'm leaving probably 6 to 8 inches in some cases, far more than I know that I'll need, just so that I don't run short, because once it's in the car, you really can't change the mounting points. Oil filter, I always use Fram filters on my models, not because they're any good, but because they're bright orange and it throws in some color. My real cars, I always date the bottom of them when I put them in. Not that I can see it when I take it out. Dang, it's been that long. Made a decal that wraps around it so that it's got all the appropriate information and warnings. Vinyl tubing was used for the oil lines. Fittings are all just machined aluminum as I need them one by one for these smaller ones, or I should say larger ones that are non-specific, non-generic, to be better sure. Here you can see the alternator assembled with the oil pump, oil filter to the oil pan, and more hardware here as a sub-assembly ready to be done to the bottom of the motor. Now we can move to the coil, next page. Brass and aluminum. It's an aluminum bracket, piece of tubing, another piece of flat soldered together, dual mounting hole. Again, back to my magazines, and found this Crane brand Fireball Coil. My research indicates it's not a really good item, but it's really cool looking with the logo. And since it doesn't have to run, I'm going after cool. And they had this really neat ignition box, which is really what led me to the coil with the fins in it. That ought to be fun to make. So back to the raw resin, just sat there and freehand milled it out, calipers and measuring. What's really nice about working with the catalogs is they give you the dimensions of the products, so you already know what scale it should be. Made the hardware, made little rubber grommets to actually mount it to a plate because you should have it insulated. And this is the oil pump, tiny little thing. Styrene and aluminum, mostly styrene with aluminum fittings would be the way that was built. And the engine is now getting flushed out, being assembled. And came time for the battery. I was starting to run out of room to put a traditional size battery. I mean, these cars are very tiny, so when you see a regular 12-volt battery, it looks like a giant. And I found these online after looking at the Optimas. A lot of people put Optima model batteries in, and I thought, yeah, I want something else. And this company specializes in smaller motorcycles, ATVs and things like that, and they have this battery made for small cars, Mini Coopers and such. So dug up all my research that I could find online, back to the raw milling of the raw resin to make the battery in the top, and used brass inserts for the terminals, and made a decal for the top. And then I've used smaller brass tubing, 2 sizes smaller, and used insulation from wire to make the black and red terminals, as they are the real thing. Made a little battery box out of sheet brass, folded up kind of origami style. That was actually machined, not cut with not done with the acid cutting. That was done with the mill to get the holes and the shapes. The next page, please. The oil tank is just a solid chunk of aluminum turned, and the band that holds it together over here was a separate, basically it's a giant hose clamp. So I made a decal that looks like the threading on a hose clamp to go around the perimeter and machine the terminal piece. This is just the overflow tank, and another brass receiver or holder for it, more aluminum, more fittings. Pretty straightforward stuff. Got to the point where I was assembling the trunk. The goal was to basically build the trunk insert with the tire inserted into the frame and add that last cap that I made out of the paintball up here. So I started thinking what more stuff good. I got a rag in mine, and I used some bungee cords to hold my jack down so it doesn't rattle. And I've got a tarp just in case I have to get out. We had this old ratty blanket in the garage. I thought, yeah, I'll make that. That looks close enough. And this hole over here is for the fuel filler for the tank. This is a Holly brand electric fuel pump, and I made a fuel sender for this is for the gauge. But the fuel pump is installed here, and ran the lines so that, well, it would work. And finally got it to was a rolling chassis. That was kind of a proud moment. You start to see it come together and realize the amount of time and energy spent actually becoming something that might actually it'll be finished, but it was just really rewarding to get to that point. And it looked like it was going to fit all together. I went back to, now it's time to start putting in the brake lines. Guitar strings, again, work really well for that. I'm not sure the letter code, but it's not the biggest one. Maybe 2 sizes down. Any musician might know what that is, but not me. Carefully bending the stuff so you don't damage the winding around it. The cooling it's the cooling winding on it now. Back then it was just a guitar string. Fitted everything so that when it comes time to put it in the car down the road, I won't have to worry about getting pliers in and damaging something. So doing it on the front end probably takes a little bit longer, but it makes the installation a lot easier. Next picture is the 2 carburetors all fleshed out, all the hardware, linkages, the whole 9 yards, on the manifold, ready to be installed in the car. And the wasn't full enough. So I made a first aid kit, but in it I put a couple of nice strong magnets, and I fixed it to the inside of the deck lid here. And that way, whenever I want to open it, I can just use a magnet and open the trunk lid, because even though it has a latch, it doesn't work. So that was a workaround I decided to use. The air cleaner is made up of a meat packing. When you get at the supermarkets, that black foam. Yeah, I save the black stuff because it looks better. The white foam seems to have too coarse of a
Porosity.
yes, and it doesn't translate well. The black may be the same size, but it visually doesn't look so bad. To make the face that holds it down on the actual air cleaner I was copying, it's a piece of aluminum, real thin aluminum, probably in real life, maybe 10 thousandths, about 50 thousandths. There's just no way I could come up with making a metal part that looked correct without being too thick. So I cut it out of self-adhesive mylar and applied that to the outside, and then used milled turn screws to make the turn screws. How about that? And here I've got the carburetors and everything, most of the engine, everything installed. And I bet you're wondering, do these things line up with the hood? I know I am. Well, the truth is they didn't. I was off by about a 1/16 of an inch, and I had the angle wrong. And I don't have a picture of it. So what I ended up doing was soldering it up around the edges, and then taking an X-Acto knife handle with sandpaper and hand finessing it until it fit. And next time I'll know to do that later. And that's not to say that I would have got it right if I had done it in the proper order either. So at this point, it was pretty much getting finished. For the paint job, I used Tamiya TS34 Camel Yellow. I wanted something really loud and vibrant, but the more I started looking at it, it was getting too loud and too obnoxious. And so I decided to tone it down with gunmetal gray with a matte finish for the sides. And but I still wanted more impact, so I came up with the idea of putting the kind of World War II inspired checkerboard scallops from an airplane on the front of it. So those are custom-made decals that I made for it. And I think that's pretty much, the rest of it went together like a regular model. Now it's just a matter of finishing it. I used two-part clear Valspar brand for the final finish on it. And once it was all assembled, I was pretty happy with it. The next page, please.
That's your last page.
I think I have one more. Didn't I send you? Yeah, should be one more.
19 pages. That's it, 19 pages.
Oh, okay, well, I guess you'll have to come up and look at it if you choose to. I made a model of the 24 scale Tamiya model of a Super 7. And I threw it in the trunk because, well, I had models in the trunk of my car. And I wasn't done. It was the weirdest thing. I spent a good 2 years on this thing, and I was happy with it, but I wasn't done. I felt like I wanted to get more enjoyment out of building it. And after I got the box done, I thought, if I was going to Salt Lake City, I'd need some maps. How would I make maps? So I found some really thin parchment paper and went online and found these different maps and made the covers of them and put the parchment paper in, and it does a pretty good job of looking like a fully fleshed out map, even though it's just a cover. It's a fake. And then I started getting really crazy, and I looked around, and I keep a Canon WD-40 in my car. So I made a Canon WD-40, and I even made the little straw. I used a piece of insulator. And then I thought, well, that's always stuck on with a piece of tape, because if you stick it in the nozzle, it'll fall out and you never find them. But probably like me, you got 20 of them stashed in your toolboxes, but that's not where you need them. So I found I could just use a piece of clear decal and use that as a Scotch tape. And since it's just laying in the trunk, it's not under any load. And if it fell off, it's just like the real thing anyways. Then I realized it's kind of a British themed car. It probably would burn oil or leak it or something. I'm kind of a Valvoline guy, so I made a Valvoline oil can, just like the stuff I keep in the trunk of my car. And I made it out of aluminum and even put the knurled lid on it and everything. And I realized it needs an indentation to put the label. And it wasn't something it should be a hard edge, it's a soft edge. So I used, I just masked off with some tape and used the acid and with a paintbrush and slowly etched away the face of it to give it a slight depression. And then I applied decals that I made to it after I painted it white. And then I grungied it up because rolling around in the trunk of my car, it's pretty nasty looking. And then, I couldn't stop myself. Well, how do you put it in? I keep a funnel in my car. So I made a funnel for it. And that turned out to be a little harder than I thought because the wall thickness is pretty thin. So I just made it out of a piece of aluminum stock until it looked about right. Most of the cutting was actually done with the center drills of a regular end mill to get the taper and the hole for the spigot. But no, I wasn't done yet. I had to make brake fluid. So I made, it's the cheapest brand, I think it's from Cragen's or something. O'Reilly's. I just happened to have it on the shelf, so that's what I made. You make what you know, and or at least you have the reference for. And even put the little dimple in the bottom of it. And each one of these became a little model in its own right that I was having fun and I was still connected to building and finishing this model. And it kind of gave me a way to back away and finish it and kind of say goodbye to the whole experience. It seemed like I just got to the point when I was done and I wasn't ready to let it go. But this allowed me to walk away with nice icing on the cake, so to speak. So I had fun building it. I'm already building another one. Not scratch build. I'm actually cannibalizing the kit, but I don't know how much will be left of the kit when it's done. But this is probably one of the best experiences I've had building a model, not for anything other than the fact that I made it, and it's the first thing I've ever made that I can say, I made this, is 100% of my brain and my hands, and whether or not you like the style, because I don't think it's that pretty, I did it, so yeah, I get to say I did it.